Yeah, we're live. Okay. Then no one was in to see it.
Nobody saw it.
Well, we're back in, and I can see that we have audio. It's not the best audio, but
We're back live. I don't know if nobody's
we got one person.
got one person on there. Okay, well, we kind of worked through that snafu. We were having, right before we started earlier, we were having some major computer issues. And we, on our YouTube channel, we don't have enough subscribers to do mobile live stream on YouTube. So, subscribe to our channel. Let's get that up. Let's get those numbers up so we can do some mobile stuff. So we were talking about routers. Talked about the couple of different types of fixed-base routers, and that would be on part one of our live stream. And so now the next step is I'm just going to show you how to throw a router bit into a router so you can get started routing.
Let's maybe give it a minute or so just to let somebody catch up. And we only got one person on.
Okay.
Text your peeps and tell them we're back.
Yeah, that's Carlos.
I mean, what did we have?
Wait a second.
Okay, looks like we're still working. This people will be able to watch this later, right?
In theory.
Huh?
In theory.
Yeah. Thought so. So, oops, we just lost somebody. We forgot the zebra. We might just have to reschedule it.
We had the first part.
Yeah.
So we got all those attempts.
They're all on the page?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, people are about somebody's back.
Plus it's 10.
Oh, it could be Tim. Is that you on there, Tim? Okay, looks like we're back on. Still got people on there?
Yes.
One person. Okay. Well, we're just going to go with this for now. We might have to redo this one on a different day to get some more people. Anyhow, on your router base, when it's time to put in the router, there are a router bit. There are a couple of different parts that you need that come with the router, of course. On the router itself, there's a socket for the router to go into. And then there's also this guy, which is basically a nut that holds the router bit in place. That's called a collet. Typically, there are two different size collets that you can use. This is a 1/2 inch collet, and this is a 1/4 inch collet. And basically, you can see that very well. But basically, what that allows for is to use router bits with different size shanks. So standard router bits have 1/4 inch shanks or 1/2 inch shanks. And that basically just depends on the size of the router bit. And we're going to take a look at a bunch of different router bits in a little bit. So in order to put the bit on, you just screw the collet onto the router right here. Oops. Not sure you can see that. It's kind of tough to see. That just gets loosely screwed onto the router. And then you slide the bit into the collet, and then tighten those two together. And you can take some wrenches and just really crank down on that. And the easiest way to tighten and loosen the routers is to have the wrenches close enough together so that you can squeeze them with your hand. good squeeze. And you want these nice and tight together. You want these nice and tight together because you don't want that to come loose, and you don't want your router bit to pop out while you're working. That's how you assemble it. We're going to go ahead and I have a round over bit. I have a round over bit in this router. It's called a round over because obviously it's going to round over the edge of the board. And I'm just going to take you through and show you how to start the router and how to make a cut. Actually, yeah, there's what I need to do. So router bits, all routers spin in the same direction. When you're using when you're looking at a router bit, there's a cutting edge on it, and as the bit is spinning, you want that cutting edge is going to be feeding into the wood and removing the material, and so it's important to know which direction to go. Here's a look at the direction of cut. This would be using a handheld router, looking down. You can see that that router bit is spinning clockwise, and the teeth are going to be the flat part of the bit is going to be coming into the board, and you want to be moving in the direction that allows the bit to keep feeding into the board. And an example of that would be, I wish we had a camera. An example of that would be this. Here's the cutting edge of this right here. It's going to be spinning clockwise and removing material from the board, and you want to continue to push the cutting edge into the material. If you go the other way with that, like this, it's going to just spin along the board very quickly. That's called a climbing cut. That can get kind of dangerous, so we don't want to do that. On this board, I'm just going to give you an example. I'm going to plug this in and make it a little bit loud while I'm routing. When you go to plug in a router, make sure that it's laying on its side and nothing is near the bit. When you go to plug it in, be aware that first of all, you do want to check that it's not turned on. And so the reason, you want to make sure that nothing is near the bit, and expect that when you go to plug it in, it might turn on. So be ready for that to happen. Like that. So you always want to be aware that of anything that's around the router, and make sure that it's not going to hit anything or catch into anything. Right? So when I'm going to make this cut, I'm going to set the router on the edge of the board, and this hand that's on the left of me here is going to be touching the board and the router. And the next step is going to be put your safety glasses on. I'm just going to hold this and balance it. I have a lot of stability with my left hand here. I'll usually hold it with for me, it's comfortable to hold it with these 3 fingers, and then these 2 fingers are resting on the board as well as the edge of my hand. So that's going to give me a lot of stability. When this router turns on, it kicks. There's definitely some torque to it. So, so when I go to turn this on, I'm going to be supporting it with my left hand. Find the switch on this one, and I'm going to hold on to it with my right hand so that it doesn't kick into the wood. And before I turn it on, I want to peek underneath, make sure that the bit is not touching the wood when it starts up, and make sure that it's not going to kick into the wood when you start it. So I'm going to just start it. I'll route a little bit of this, and then we'll show you what that looks like. So all I did was put a round over on the edge of the board there. And if you notice that when I got to the end of my cut, I just did the exact opposite of what I did to start it out. I moved the router away from the material, put my hand on top here to stabilize it, and then just turn it off, and then moved it away until the router bit stopped spinning. So that's just a very basic cut. So it's an easy way to remember which way you should be moving when you're cutting. So I was cutting, obviously, my router bit is spinning clockwise, and I'm moving this way. When I'm cutting on the outside of a board like this, that board should be on your left, on the left side of your body. If I'm going to cut if I were standing here with the board on the right side of my body, as I start cutting, that bit is spinning this way, and it's going to pull the router away, and it's not going to give you a good cut, and it can be potentially pretty dangerous depending on the size of your bit and what you're doing. That's called a climb cut. It can be pretty dangerous to do that. So when you're cutting on the outside of a board like this, it should be on the left side of your body and moving forward. At that point, I usually go, any questions? And then yes. All right, we're still all working sound and all that. So we have a decent collection of router bits here at DIY Cave, but by no means enough of them. We're constantly looking for new router bits, and there are lots of different shapes and sizes of them that you can get. So looking at a basic bit here, let's just pick this one. And this one. Okay, these are two very different bits. This green guy here is called a cove bit, and because it makes a cove in the edge of a board or on the corner of a board, and this one's called a beading bit, which makes a little bead on the edge of the board. So I chose these two because they are one of them. This one's a 1/2-inch shank. This one's a 1/4-inch shank. So those are the two. Those will fit the two different collets that we have. The reason that one has a smaller shank than the other, it could be for a couple of different reasons. This one is obviously the size of the bit. That's a pretty small bit, so a 1/2-inch shank would be pretty big on that bit. Oh, there we go. Nice, thank you. This bit is quite a bit heavier and larger, so it has that nice 1/2-inch shank on there. You can, by the way, get this bit. It's a little bit of a blurry problem. You can get this bit with a 1/4-inch shank. The reason that you might want to get it in a 1/4-inch shank is because perhaps you only have a 1/4-inch collet. If you do have a 1/2-inch collet, I always prefer to get the bigger shanks just because it makes the router bit, I'm guessing, in my opinion, a little less prone to vibrating or breaking. So I like the beefier bits when I can get them. So bits come in tons of different shapes and sizes depending on what you're doing with them. The ones on this tray are just an array of bits that we either had for different purposes or bought for something specific. Some of them we buy to just have a set of very commonly used bits, like the round over bits or the cove bits. Some of them are specialty bits, for instance. And so this is an example of something that you can do with a router. This is a surfacing bit, and it's designed to cut on the top and the edges. It's really kind of like a big slotting bit, depending on how you use it. But the way that this gets used in DIY Cave is that we have a jig that Tim is grabbing. Whoa! Thanks, Tim. Tim's breaking. So this is a jig that we can mount our quarter cable router into, and this plate rides in some rails on the edge of this plate rides back and forth on these rails with this bit running, and it's used for flattening the surface of some wood, or it looks like in this case, maybe somebody had an epoxy surface, and they used this bit to flatten that surface by making passes back and forth, and then moving the jig a little bit, making another pass back and forth. So this can be used to for instance, flatten the top of a stump if you wanted to, and that's what that bit is for. So there are lots and lots of different uses for routers and router bits. If you're starting out and you don't have any bits and you kind of want a lot of different shapes, you can get something like this. This is an older Skill made this set of bits, and it just has a whole lot of different shapes in it. A lot of them you may use. A few of them in here you may rarely use, but it's nice to have a good assortment. And when I started buying bits, I started with shapes that I knew that I would use. So, for instance, the round over bits like this often come in a set of 4, and you can get them. They're in quarter, 3/8, half, and 3/4 inch radius. And same with the Cove bits. Same with these Cove bits. They often come in like a set of 4 that you can buy together, so that you have those incremented sizes, because it's a very common thing. I have a couple up here also that I like to show. This is a pretty special bit too. This is a vertical panel raising bit, and it's made for making the panel, the edge of a panel in a raised door. And this has to be used on a router table. You can't use this in a handheld router just because of the way it works. It's too dangerous. And in this case, the panel would be standing up vertically when you use this mounted in a router table with a fence. And we're going to show you the setup on the router table here in just a moment. So in the router. So during the course of cabinet making and lots of furniture making, this is one of the most common bits there is. In the wood shops that I've worked in, there was always a router with a router that was dedicated to this bit. This bit stayed in the router all the time. This is called a flush trim router. If you can see, it has a bearing on the top. And as well as a lot of the router bits I just showed you, a lot of them do have a bearing there so that it can ride along part of the wood. This is essentially a straight cutting bit with a bearing at the top, and it's used for flushing up 2 pieces of wood so that if you assemble, let's see if I can. Keep writing that piece of cotton. If you assemble 2 parts together, if I were to glue these 2 parts together, I would typically leave this solid piece sticking out a little bit from the face of this piece, and then I would use that bit. I would use this bit with the bearing riding along the piece to trim that board flush to the surface of this bit. And this is done all day long. It's done a lot, and that's just one of the uses of that flush trim bit. Another good use for the flush trim bit is template routing. So this is just this isn't an actual thing. It's just a shape that I made so that I could demonstrate this during classes. This is just a template that I would use to attach to a piece of wood or plywood, and use the flush trimming bit. Use the flush trimming bit to follow along the template and make that piece of wood the same shape as my template. So this piece of plywood, I just cut out on the bandsaw. I put the template on there and traced it and just cut it on the bandsaw. It hasn't been flush trimmed yet. So you can see the line of the bandsaw there. Then this template will get attached to the part, and then I'll take it on the router table typically. I'll take it over to the router table, or sometimes handheld router. You can do it either way, depending on the size of the part. Smaller parts are hard to do with a handheld router, and larger parts are extremely, like a tabletop or something that size, or something large that you want to template, is difficult to do on the router table because obviously if it's something like a curved tabletop, you can't hold the tabletop and run it over the router table. So I'm just going to screw this template on here, and that's where we'll start. We'll trim this piece on the router table. I'll show you how to set up the router table. So I'm just using, for this example, I'm just using a couple of screws to mount the template to the plywood, and I'll often do that if one side of the material that I'm routing isn't going to be seen. I'll just screw those holes in there. There are other ways to attach a template. That could be means by double-sided tape, or building a jig with clamps on it to hold them together, or you could glue it on there with hot melt, or something like that. Or you can even put a couple of little nails in there that you can probably nail holes later, the small brads, and then move the template from it. So right now, I'm just going to screw this on here to prepare it for our routing. Okay, so we've got our template attached to our curved piece, and it's ready to be routed as soon as we set up the router table. It looks like I put that on there a little bit crooked, but it's still in a good position. Just making sure that I'm going to cut the whole thing, and my goal is typically to not have so much material sticking out. I've got quite a bit there, but this is pretty soft material. If I were working with hardwood, I would want this template to be right on the line. Okay, so this is our router table. This is a shop-made table. You can either make your own router table or purchase one. I've made several different router tables over the years, and I like to make them myself. Okay, I like to make them myself because I like to make them different sizes and shapes. And I've had a couple of thank you. I've had a couple of router tables in the past that were commercially made, and they worked well, but I didn't see the need to spend the money on them because it's fairly easy to make a router table. This one is just a cabinet with a top on it. It's got an aluminum plate. This plate with all these holes in it has been to the several different routers. So you can see here on the bottom, our fixed base for the Porter cable is attached to the bottom of this plate. And then it's got this big hole with a couple of different size inserts here that can accommodate different size bits. So that just pops in there. Maybe it does. So to install the router motor into the base plate, find the router motor. Find the router motor, This is that motor. This is that base plate that spins on. This one is a little bit different than the last one I showed you. That one's got that clamp right there to hold it tight. This one's got like this big wing nut deal to hold it tight, but they both fit on the same router. So to mount this, we're just going to set it on there and give that a little spin, and I'll tighten it up a little bit just to get my base plate snug. And then because I'm going to be routing this templated piece, we have to set the proper height of the router. So what I'm going to do is set my material on the router and then just give the plate a turn until I get that bearing right where I want it. So that's pretty much how to set the height on that. And you can do that for different needs as well. So if you're setting like the round over bit that we used over there, you can do the same thing without using the material even. You can just put the bit in there and then just turn this base plate until you get the profile of the router bit where you want it. So if I had this one in there, this round over bit, I would just turn the base plate until I got to a point on this bit where that I would make it even with the surface of the base plate so that I have the profile that I want to cut. Talk back to me. So on this one, with this wing nut style deal, I'm going to give that a good crank. And then I'm also, these things are notoriously come loose on these older Porter cable ones, as opposed to the clamp ones. The clamp ones they're a lot easier to use, but they can wear out as well. There is an adjusting nut on it to tighten it up if you have to. Eventually they get bent or broken over the years, but this part can be replaced. This wing nut on here is aluminum, so they end up breaking after a while. And I'll just take a wrench after I have that on there. I'll just take a wrench and just give that a little crank to make sure it's really tight and it's not going to come loose. And then I'll just drop this plate into the hole. The hole on this router table. Tilt that over so you can see it. The hole on this router table was actually routed to fit that specific base plate. So that one that I showed you was a Freud aluminum base plate, really heavy duty. This is a really heavy duty base plate. You can get these online, and you can get these in different configurations and made out of different materials like Lexan or other plastics. And I've had a couple of them that were made out of a heavy duty plastic that also had these insert rings in different sizes to accommodate different size bits. So you can buy these and then make a template for it and route that hole in the table yourself. And so we should make a video on this table. So I'll just drop this in. It has some screw mounting holes, and depending on what operation I'm doing, sometimes I will screw that down if I want to make sure that the router is not going to move at all. This one's got a little bit of play in it, not too much, but it can shift around a little bit. For what we're doing, we're following this bearing, so it doesn't really matter if this shifts a hair. If we were using the fence, and I'll show you how to set that up too, and it had to be a very precise cut, then I would screw this thing down to the table. So let's just double check that. Yep, that's pretty good. So what I did there was set it so that the bearing's going to ride along here while the edge of the cutting tooth is going to be tall enough to cut all the way through the material below it, and it's just going to flush it up nicely to to the template. So when you're on a table like this and you're freehanding, there's meaning no fence. We are going to be following along with that bearing. There is another part that goes with this, which we still don't have, but I have. It's called a starter pin, and what it allows you to do, there's a pin that inserts into the top of the table. We had a couple of them; they've gone missing, but I was able to find this little guy here. That's I don't even know what that is, but it has a top on it. This part will go into the hole in the base plate, and this part will stick above it. And just pop that here. And what that allows you to do is it gives you a solid item to lean against and it allows you to slowly work your way into the template. On some bits where you're going to follow a bearing like this, depending on the shape of the bit, there are a couple of things that go on when this thing's running. For part of it, you can't see the edge of the bit, or you can't see how large the bit is when it's spinning. So when you go to move your material into it, you don't know when you're going to come in contact. So if you have this starter in here, that allows you to really nice and easily move into the bit and start your cut. On this template, when I attached it, you can see it's sticking past a little bit on each end. I like to make my templates a little bit bigger than the wood. That gives me a starting point here where the bearing is going to touch before we start cutting. And I'll use that starter pin to ease in, and then as soon as I'm touching the bit, I move away from the starter pin. When I'm routing curves and things like this, I like to put my router table not near any walls, depending on the size of my piece, because I move around the table as I'm working. I'm not standing in one spot. While I'm cutting, I don't want to be in contact with the router pin at all, because that can push my material away from the router bit itself. So let's make this cut to see what that looks like. How do we do that? And remember, I didn't check this router, so it might be on. So make sure that nothing is near your material, or near your bit. Yep, that one's on too. We'll just turn that back off. That's just a good habit that I've always gotten into, was always expecting the router to be on. So I make sure that there's nothing around it, and I'm always ready to just pull it back off. But some of these, like this one, has that little plastic cover on there. You can't even see the markings on the switch itself anymore. So I never know when they're on or off until I plug them in. So let me get some safety glasses. Routers are very loud, so definitely wear hearing protection. I don't have any earmuffs in here, but I do have some earplugs. Definitely wear your eyeglasses and hearing protection. There's a lot of debris that goes flying when you're using the router, whether it's handheld or in the table. And if you have a fence on your router table, that you can hook dust collection to it if you build it properly, or if you buy a fence that has a dust collection port. So let's take a look at how we're going to cut this. So when I start this, I'm going to be on the pin, and then I'm going to move into the router bit, and then I'm going to move my body away, and then just go right around the curve. So now that piece, where's my microphone? So now that piece is cut to the same shape as the template. So this is extremely useful in making multiple shapes of different things. especially if you're doing curves. I've built a lot of curved cabinetry that have layers of moldings, and this is the way to do it. So I would make templates for all the different shapes and radii that I need, and then I would use those and mount them to the material, and then make my curves. So if you're going to be making some molding or something like that, that's straight, or putting a shape on the edge of a board, that's just straight, then you can do it just the way that I did it and just follow along with the bearing on the wood itself. So here's my piece of wood. I could stand here and just do this freehand because I do have a bearing, but it's much easier to use a fence and give your board some support so that you're keeping it straight and you're getting a good cut. And the fence also helps to protect your hands. And the fence also allows you to use bits that don't, oh, sorry, let me back up. The fence also allows you to use bits that don't have a bearing on them. So there are quite a few bits that don't have that top bearing, and the fence allows you to follow along or set the depth of your cut or the shape of your cut according to the fence. So we're going to throw this fence on here. So this is a shop-made fence. Really easy to make, but you do want to make sure that it's nice and square. And this one's got a small dust collection port on the back, so that we can hook up a vacuum to it or a dust collector and turn that on while we're routing, and that will get rid of a lot of the debris. So when I set up this fence, when we were talking about direction of cut before, the router bit was pointing down. So now we're looking at the router in the opposite direction. So it's actually spinning counterclockwise. And when we set up our fence, there's a diagram. When we set up our fence, our router is going to be buried inside of the fence with the front portion of the router bit sticking out. And since it's spinning this way, we want the teeth, the cutters, to be feeding into the wood rather than flowing with the wood. So we're gonna push the board into the teeth of the router. So that's going to be that way. And so the reason that we're going to bury half of this bit, or actually most of it, this one, in this case, if we're using this flush trim bit, we're going to pretty much bury the whole thing in there. It doesn't really make sense to have this flush trim bit in there right now. But if I were, actually, I could raise this flush trim bit up a bit and take a little bit off the edge of this board if I want to. But the reason that we're going to have that buried in there is because the bit is turning this way. If we were to move that fence back and run the board behind the router bit, that bit is spinning this way. So I'm sure you can imagine what's going to happen when you start routing. It's just going to grab it out of your hand and shoot it across the room. So we're going to want to be on this side of that router bit. So like I said before, when we were doing the handheld router, the material was on the left of our body. On the router table with it pointing up, the material is going to be on the right of our body. So this fence, there are lots of options for how to attach this fence to the table. Some people use slots with screws so they can slide the fence forward and back. My preference is just to clamp it in place. Because the router bit is round and it's spinning, it doesn't matter if this is parallel to the front edge of the table, unless you're doing something with a guide like a miter gauge or something that guides your piece perpendicular to a slot in the table. If you have a slot in the table that you're using for some sort of jig to hold your material, then this fence would want to be parallel to that slot. In this case, it doesn't really matter what direction this thing aims in, as long as you align it with your bit. So I've got a couple of clamps here. When I go to set this up, I'll usually take a straight edge or a piece of wood, put it across the fence, and then back it up to my bit. In this case, I'm gonna line up with this bearing. So I just touch the bearing there with the piece of wood, and then I'm going to clamp one end of the fence in place. Oh, somehow that's somebody over there.
Mhm.
So I have that kind of close. I have this side clamped down. I can still pivot this fence if I want to.
Yes, move it over.
I can still pivot the fence, so I'm just going to move it until I have it in line with the bit, or the bearing in this case. Then I'm going to clamp the other side up. So now when I go and run my piece along there, it's going to come in contact with that bearing and be right exactly where I want it. And this could be any shaped bit. And there are different, if you're using a different shaped bit that doesn't have a bearing, you would use that to set the depth of your fence. For instance, let's try this one. So this is a straight cutting bit without a bearing on it. And in this case, I would, depending on how deep I want my cut, that's where I would set the fence. I'd have this in the router in here, and then I'd move my fence back and forth until I got it to a position that was the correct depth for whatever I'm doing. Good on that. So I'm just going to take this off and take a look at a couple of other things here. So this is that same shaped piece, and it has a shape routed into it. You can see that profile. This was a piece that was used in our class, and we did the same process of what we just did to get it this shape, but then additionally we added a shape to the underside of this, and that was done. Let's see. That was done with a bit like this. The bearing has been taken off of this for now to be used in a different way. But it was done the same way that we just flush routed this. We had this bit in the router table with the bearing, and the bearing now followed along our piece of wood that we had previously shaped. So that's another use for template work and how you can set up a router bit without the template. After this piece was made, we made a cut with a bit like this. There are lots of different things that you can do with the routers. You can do inlay work. You can do inlay work, which would be using the router to route out a space in a board to fit another piece of wood into. Routers are used constantly for installing hinges. They're used a lot for, like I said before, flattening the material with a jig. And there are plenty of templates available for doing inlay work or jig work. You can look up in woodworking catalogs and buy them or make your own. A couple of cool jigs that we have here. I'll just grab one to show you. This guy here is called a dovetail jig, and this is used with a router for making dovetail boxes. And it's essentially just a template for a dovetail bit to follow along with. It works with a dovetail bit that's similar to this, and on the bottom of the router, on the bottom of the router, there's this hole in the middle, and a bushing can be placed in there that works as a guide for this router bit. And once you set up this jig, it follows along these fingers to make your joint. So there are lots of different applications like that you can use, along with bushings and bearings. You can use it to follow those shapes, and it's very similar to what we were doing with the flush trimmer, just a kind of a different application there. So some of the, there is another application with the router. We've got a small one in the back corner. We can't kind of get you over there to see it because we're not mobile. But it's a CNC router. We have a small one in the back corner here, and that's just a computer controlled router. And some of those could be bought fairly inexpensively or built as in a kit. And with those, you use a CAD program to program the movements of the router to cut different shapes. Ours can actually do some 3D work, so it'll move in all directions, up, down, left, and right, to create whatever pattern you want to make. So if you missed the beginning of this or didn't get to see our beginning of the other video before the snafu, we went through the different types of routers, including fixed base router, great option for a new router, and the plunge base that goes on to our router that's now on the table. And the trim router. So these are very common routers that are available at your local big box store or online. And we have these here at the Cave if you're going to come in and do some work as a member or use the shop. We can get you up and running on these. And we do have a class on the routers that comes up on the schedule once in a while. Just a quick mention that starting today with the shutdown, again, we did cancel all of our classes indefinitely. We'll get those back up on the schedule as soon as we have a little bit more information. If you have any questions about any of anything with the router or the tools that we have at the Cave, you can always email us, send us a message, hit us up on our social media, and we're happy to talk about whatever equipment that we have here and give you some answers. All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. We will try this again with better equipment.
Carl says thanks.